So what will bring us back? Well, what will bring us back and save everything is several million years of time, which would be a little bit late for your kids.
Yeah, John, Jay has a question. Vanessa, do you have a comment?
Oh, no, he answered it.
Okay.
Not about climate change, social science.
Jay?
My question's for Vanessa. When I saw the name, I said, oh, wow, the same name as the famous scientist, actually the daughter. I wonder if you could speak to your, I know that wasn't the focus of your presentation, but if you could speak a bit about the repression, and that's another key part of post-history, the political repression. What happened to your father being fired from LSU as a tenured professor?
Hey, can you hear me?
How did that happen?
There we go.
Okay.
So we're just finishing up questions from the last panel. We've
So
got about a
my
minute or two.
dad was
Cool.
out against the Corps of Engineers in a federal trial.
Vanessa.
And so he was fired. Then first he was.
But he was a tenured professor.
Yes.
Okay.
So first he was revoked of his teaching. And then after, so LSU told him that if he spoke out against the Corps of Engineers as a public citizen, that he would be terminated. And he decided to take that, and he did it anyway. To say that he had a knowledge that the Corps of Engineers, they messed up with the levies, and so he took the chance and did speak out. And so they terminated him. Since then, he's still been very active. He's active in the BPOL school. He was a researcher there. Right now, he is enjoying retirement in Virginia. He is living with Chesapeake.
But did he challenge this in court? It does not seem like this was.
Yes. So he fought again. He sued Louisiana State University, and after months and months of trials and case studies, LSU actually settled with him instead of pursuing it.
Out of court, so it
Yes.
didn't go to.
Yeah.
So that case has become now one of the modern examples of why tenure is valuable, because of the need for academics to be able to question do those questions without fear of retribution. Yeah. So you might think it's strange that LSU does not have a hurricane center. It's the state that experienced hurricanes. That was more important than the truth, right?
Even if they have tenure protection, it will be illegally dismissed, and there will be an out-of-court settlement. This happened to the Ward Churchill, it happened to Finkelstein. There's very powerful interests that are willing to fork out a whole bunch of money to get rid of these guys. And silence voices that are just doing what they're.
I'll just add a coincidence. I also was denied tenure at LSU for political activism. So good company.
But this should be resisted. I mean, if the Senate's delayed the case, we probably win a award, damages plus get his position back, and that's would have been important to get that decision in favor of the product.
Yeah.
I can clearly understand. I'm not
Yeah. I mean,
criticizing him for that.
it's interesting because when I applied to LSU, I did get in, but I was informed with my acceptance that I was not going to be taken seriously as a student because of my father was. So that's why I came.
That's as if there's some bias going on
Yeah.
for some reason.
I mean, I love this school, so, but yeah, that was.
We have Harry, so
Yeah.
is there any other comments or anything? Harry, do you hear us?
Yes, I do.
Great. So he is a Renaissance man. Harry Shearer. He's done a great service by doing a documentary on the hurricane and its impact on New Orleans, and also through his radio show, The Show, he's informed millions of fans of listeners about some of the aspects of what happened with the hurricane and all that. So he's multi-talented. But I think we'll have a conversation, Harry, if you can just speak for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then maybe Sean can ask some questions, and we'll open it up for questions as well. How's that?
Let's thank these guys first before.
Yep.
Great, guys.
I have to say, I was denied tenure by LSU as well, and I never even taught there. So it's really this is way out of control. Look, Ivor is one of my heroes. I made this documentary called The Big Uneasy, which I guess most of you saw, because I had talked to Ivor, to Dr. Bob B. from UC Berkeley, to Maria Garzino, whistleblower inside the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, on my radio show in the years after the flood, as the information was becoming public. And in October of 2009, I was sitting in a new house that I had just gotten, no furniture. My laptop, this laptop's predecessor, was sitting on a cardboard box, and I was watching the live internet feed of President Obama making his first presidential visit to New Orleans. And when he referred to the flooding of New Orleans as a natural disaster, he had an elegantly framed way of saying it that sounded like he was maybe suggesting that there was human culpability, but basically what he was doing was assigning human culpability to the response, not to the flood, and therefore knocking his predecessor. At that moment, I thought, okay, two possibilities. Either he knows or he doesn't know. And I couldn't figure out which was worse as a theory, as a working hypothesis. But I did think, okay, the radio show is clearly not enough to penetrate American consciousness about what's happened in New Orleans and why. So I thought, what do people do this at this day and age? They make documentary films. I know how to make a film, and I know all these people because I'd already spoken to them on the radio. So I thought it would be a thing to do. And we were approaching the 5th anniversary of the flood. And I thought, well, the national media are going to come to New Orleans like flies come to dog poop because it's the 5th anniversary. They can't resist. And if I get the film out in time, they will be able to say, here's what we've learned since then. That was my mistake. They did come to New Orleans in that very manner that I described. And what they did was they sat there in New Orleans and reran their footage from 5 years earlier and saying, weren't we great? Weren't we wonderful? Didn't we wag our finger in Mary Landrieu's face? So it was a profoundly instructive and frustrating experience. Not just talking about the television networks. NPR was similarly resistant to the story. I didn't care if they ever mentioned my name. This was not a career move on my part. I have a day job, but I did want the story out. And so I went around the country for the following year, for about half the next year with the film, because I realized local newspapers would cover the story as I went from town to town with the film. And that was pretty much the only way people were going to be exposed to the story. I'll interrupt myself to point out that there's an interesting piece in this Sunday's New York Times Magazine that seemingly is on a very different subject. It's a writer who's investigating the investigative reporter, Seymour Hersh's story, saying basically what we think we know about the assassination of, or the killing of, Osama bin Laden is 100% not true. That's Seymour Hersh's assertion that he published in a story in the London Review of Books. This is a New York Times Magazine writer now chasing after Seymour Hersh, saying, how did you do this? How did you find this out? What is all this about? The writer of the New York Times Magazine piece, who is raising some questions, but doesn't quite say he believes or he doesn't believe Hersh's analysis or his reporting, does say at some point in the piece a crucial phrase, that journalism is about narratives, and once the people who run journalism, editors and producers of television, once they hook on to the narrative, they bend facts to the narrative. This is a somewhat familiar usage because in the case of the Iraq War, in the lead up to the Iraq War, a major figure in British intelligence was in Washington in 2002 and reported back that the intelligence was being, his word, fixed to fit the policy. Journalism is working in much the same way as government. You reach your conclusion first, and then you fit the facts to your conclusion. And the conclusion the national media reached was humongous hurricane, city below sea level, mainly poor black victims, and no factual interference allowed. There's a wonderful other example of this phenomenon in action. An investigative journalist of high repute, I really respect him greatly, but not just me, others too, named Peter Maas wrote a piece about the iconic moment in April of 2003 when you were all babies and Saddam Hussein's statue was toppled in the center of Baghdad. And this was about 3 weeks after the United States invaded, and this was trumpeted as the citizens of Baghdad, in their joy at the arrival of the Americans, were finally toppling the statue of the hated dictator. And what Peter Maas did was went and talked to the reporters and photographers who were there at the time, who said to a man and a woman, there were so few Iraqis in that square, the Marines had to come in with a winch and pull down the statue because there weren't enough Iraqis to topple it. They were just sort of standing there looking at it. And the reporters and photographers were cabling or calling their producers and editors in New York saying, let us turn the camera around and show you that part of the story. And the editors and producers in New York were saying, no, we're seeing on CNN that Iraqis are tearing down the statue. That's what we want to see. That's what we want you to report. The facts being fitted to the narrative. It is something that's not just happening in this country. I made a follow-up radio documentary for the BBC on the occasion of the 10th anniversary, looking back at New Orleans 10 years after the flood, what we know since then. They broadcast it, thank goodness. But 3 times in the week leading up to the broadcast, a producer from one of their news programs interviewed me to say we wanted to discuss this broadcast on our news program, and 3 times they can't call back to say, no, we don't. So there is a resistance, and I don't think there's any reason why the BBC has any dealings with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I think it's this much more deep-seated, we have our narrative, thank you, and we like it the way it is. But then we get to the Corps, which is now we get away from my little story and into the big story. I became aware of the Corps of Engineers growing up in Los Angeles. One day I asked my parents, what's that big concrete ditch that keeps trailing through the city? And they said, oh, that used to be the river. And I read up on it, and there was a flood in 1937. And the Corps of Engineers did, as they did a lot in those days, came around after a flood and said, we can fix it so you'll never have a flood again. And the city fathers said, okay, that's a good deal. And they encased what was called an occasional river. It occasionally had water in it, and then occasionally didn't. You know, it's a dry country we live in here in Southern California. And they encased it in concrete. And if you grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was basically notable for 2 things. Laundromats would send their waste suds down the river, down this river concrete straitjacket, so you just see this sudsy water passing by, and every once in a while it'd be cleared out for a chase scene in a movie. And that was the first time I realized what the Corps of Engineers did for a living. There's a wonderful book written by 2 reporters from the Tampa Bay Times called Paving Paradise, which discusses the Clean Water Act, which was passed in the early 70s under the Nixon administration. And the Clean Water Act had a provision in it saying that there needed to be no net loss of wetlands going forward. So any development that any state did, it had to ensure that there was no net loss of wetlands. And the agency in Florida that was in charge of enforcing that part of the Clean Water Act was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Short version of the story is 30 years later, major net loss of wetlands. By the way, it was the Corps of Engineers which, along with land developers, their dear friends in a lot of cases, had a serious degree of responsibility for the near destruction of the Everglades, and it is now the Corps of Engineers to whom Congress turns for an attempt to fix the Everglades. Michael Grunwald, who wrote a wonderful series of articles in the Washington Post about the Corps of Engineers in the year 2000, says that this is their business model: get paid to break things and then get paid to fix them. It's not a bad business model, because you make money both ways. But the Corps of Engineers, I think one of the reasons in this country, aside from the narrative principle that I outlined earlier, why this story doesn't get legs, why news organizations don't feel it's a sexy story, partly because, yes, you have to understand a little bit about engineering. Bob B. says engineering is basically 90% common sense. I know I didn't walk faster past any building when I was in school than the engineering building, so I had no affection for or talent for that at all, and yet I was able to absorb what Bob and Ivor and others were telling me pretty quickly. Journalists like to say, we don't like to get into the weeds. Well, sorry, but your job is you go into the weeds, you comprehend this stuff, and then you make it comprehensible to people who don't have time or the willingness to go into the weeds, i.e. your readers and viewers. So it's a cop-out for them to say that. But I think there's another thing. The story of the Corps of Engineers confounds partisan narratives about how the world works. The left says government is capable of doing good things. The right says the market will take care of everything. The Corps of Engineers, starting in the 80s, as you may have heard in my film, was somewhat hollowed out. They no longer do their own construction. They do some of the design. But most of that work is now contracted out. And now there is this web of private contractors who do most of their work with the Corps. Bob B., who was in my film, saying that a lot of engineers didn't even want to talk to him after he went public criticizing the Corps because they still have to work for the Corps. That's the major source of their employment. So you have arguably, and I'll dip into just a moment of political science here. You want power centers to compete. You don't want power centers to collude. You want the private sector to be a check on the public sector and vice versa. But you have this thing called private-public partnerships, where the private companies now sup at the trough of a public agency, and a public agency satisfies these private corporations, and the private corporations provide money for Congress people to get reelected so they continue to fund the public agency that continues to feed them. It is arguable that this defies all of the preconceptions of both the right and the left. It doesn't fit into the talking points of either Fox or MSNBC. And so nobody can get political mileage out of the story of the Army Corps of Engineers. It is the worst of both worlds. The worst of the profit-seeking of the private sector and the worst of the budget-seeking, the budget increase-seeking of a bloated public sector. And by the way, this is not peculiar to the Corps. This is the way the larger Defense Department works. If you want a case history of it right now in action, look no further than this new jet fighter. Well, it's not a fighter. It's not capable of dogfighting. It's been proven. Called the F-135, the most expensive plane in history, which all tests so far indicate is not able to do as well as the plane it's supposed to replace. But it costs about a third of $1 billion per plane, and a lot of private companies like to make more of those, and the Defense Department likes to keep increasing its budget. So the Corps of Engineers is sort of a subset of all that. The problem is jet fighters, as loathsome as the idea may be that they're not capable of dogfighting, they're not going to be called to do a lot of that in the present day and age. Those aren't the wars we have to fight. It's a mammoth waste of money. But what the Corps of Engineers does, as we've seen in New Orleans, is kill people, kill Americans, kill our fellow Americans. It's a much more serious problem. And what we know now that we didn't know when I made the film, among them is this. Bob Marshall, a great environmental journalist in New Orleans, pointed this out just before the 10th anniversary. So I think the piece came out in early August. the new improved system that folks have been bragging, folks in the Army Corps of I'm sorry, that's Obama speak. People in the Army Corps of Engineers have been bragging about and saying in the most embarrassingly feeble boast imaginable. Their boast is New Orleans has never had better, stronger flood protection. Well, yeah, we know what happened last time. You know, that's like saying, oh, I'm not even going to use a metaphor or a simile. But anyway, this system was built to a far less stringent standard, a far lower standard than the system that failed. The system that failed was congressionally mandated to have been built to withstand the maximum probable hurricane to hit New Orleans. Now, the Corps miscalculated that. It ignored new information about how the situation on the ground had changed, all that. But that was still the standard they were supposedly building to. The new system, $14 billion worth that we've just spent, was built to the standard of a 1 in 100 year event. Bob Marshall points out the reason that was selected is that is the minimum standard for a community to qualify for flood insurance. The state and the city government were so desperate to get people back, they had to assure them that they would qualify for flood insurance. So they settled for that lower standard that the Corps and the Congress proposed. And that is the system we have today. Second thing we've learned, perhaps even more disturbing, my whistleblower friend inside the Corps emailed me a couple months ago, sent me a trove of documentation, weeds as the journalists would call it, emails, internal emails, drawings, photographs from this situation. As we know, desert communities, we just saw it in the case of Palmdale yesterday, are sometimes subject to flash flooding, torrential sudden rains, even in the midst of drought. Somewhere in the Las Vegas area, the Corps of Engineers has built a flood wall to protect against such flash flooding. Last September, there was a torrential rainfall, there was flooding, a portion of that flood wall collapsed. Internal emails, drawings, photographs reveal that the Corps of Engineers is aware that the reason that portion of the wall collapsed is because the entire length of the wall is structurally deficient. It has a design deficiency. The internal emails indicate that there then followed several days or weeks of discussion inside the Corps. Do we admit that this entire wall has a design deficiency and fix it? Or do we just prop up the part that fell down and cover it up? I leave it to your imaginations which solution they would opt. So that's what I have to say.
So one thing, so we can have people want to ask questions. You're welcome to come up, but I'll just start with. So Harry, this morning before you, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. We had some other friends from New Orleans talk to us this morning, and we began with the discussion of what actually happened during the actual, storm and flooding and stuff. And one of the discussions was about what do you do when people needed water and food, right? And that there was not a supply of food and water, so people, basically what we might call looted, right? They went in and got some food and water, but that quite quickly everybody came to the realization that yes, we've learned since grade school that we shouldn't break the law, we shouldn't go into the storm, but the reality was we just had to, right? And that the majority of it was not, of course it happened, but the majority wasn't stealing TVs and this and that. It was more to get essential supplies. And, the law said you couldn't, but that's what we got to do. It's been a decade now of this massive Corps caused tragedy. And we have great journalism and documentaries and articulation that this is the problem. And it shows no sign of abating, right? This behavior. So sort of picking up that theme from this morning, not that everybody should go break the law per se, but it seems like this is not working, right? We know from the lawsuits that we're not allowed to sue the federal government, right? They're protected from legal recourse. So, okay.
Well, yeah, with one exception. There's one lawsuit that has proceeded to trial, and it's on a novel theory of the law. Well, it's not that novel, but it's novel in this particular situation, which is the 5th and 14th Amendments prohibit the federal government from taking, or state governments from taking, private property without due process of law. The argument in this case is that the Corps of Engineers, through their negligent lack of maintenance of the Mr. Go canal, which they dug as an alternative, as a straight line alternative to the curvilinear Mississippi River, destroyed people's property, that it was a taking in the legal word, and that they therefore owe compensation for the taking. That's still a live case in the courts. But yes, the general principle is there. Two things. First, one of the major reasons that the activity you describe was framed as animals on the rampage by the media, animals looting, is because the mayor and the police chief of New Orleans went on the Oprah Winfrey show 4 days into the flood and repeated rumors about babies being raped and all sorts of unimaginable horrors going on in the Superdome and the convention center, all of which have been proven. I go into this in some detail in the BBC documentary. All the efforts to try to nail down any of these events results in nothing. 4 people died in the Superdome. None of them were murdered. They were in incredibly stressful circumstances. A lot of the people who had to go to the Superdome were older. Most of the people who died in the so-called Katrina incident were older and or poorer. The mayor and the police chief went on television and spread these rumors. Both of them were African American. Neither of them ever apologized. Neither of them ever called this stuff back. So they were partly responsible for the spreading of these canards, which made not only the people who were trying to protect their families and feed them and get them water turned into some kind of abject criminality, but it is argued by some that there were problems in getting National Guardsmen and or other volunteers to come to the city's aid in the days following those rumors being spread, because they were afraid of what kind of jungle they were walking into. That is to say, they thought that the picture painted by the mayor and the police chief was an accurate one. Nobody has ever been found to have even fired at a helicopter, by the way. Washington Post did a long piece about trying to find out if that had actually happened. So you find in situations of chaos and emergency and a disaster, rumors will be rampant. Rumors are rife. Rumors spread through the Superdome. Gee, there were no lights, no electricity, no water, no air conditioning. People huddled together in a large building. The roof is off. Rumors are going to spread. Public officials and journalists have a responsibility not to just put them out wholesale and say, hey, I heard this. That's something we could learn. Second thing is, there was a difficult time, apparently, that the federal government experienced in getting food and water down to New Orleans, even though that hurricane had been sitting in the Gulf for 4 or 5 days looking bigger and meaner. The Corps of Engineers, which is responsible for doing this, didn't even have sandbags filled as an eventuality against possible breaching. They were so confident and so arrogant about their own work, they didn't start filling sandbags to try to fill the breaches until the Wednesday following the Monday of the flood. But the federal government did do something very quickly. I don't know if you've read, I'm sure you've read the book. Now
Which one? Mark's Listings book?
No. Zaytoon. Have you read Zaytoon?
No.
Dave Eggers' book.
Oh, Dave Eggers. Yeah.
So Zaytoon is a Syrian-American painting contractor. Has been in New Orleans for 20 years, successful businessman, wife and 2 kids. He sends them out of the city when the flood approaches. He stays in the city. Now it's flooding. He's got a boat. He goes out to see if he can help anybody. He's a Syrian American. He looks like an Arab. A National Guardsman arrests him, and suddenly he finds himself in some place that the federal government built overnight, a detention facility in the Greyhound bus parking lot where he was held incommunicado for 30 days. So the federal government did do something quickly.
But with regards to the core, how do we, I'm not sure how to affect change. So just yesterday I was in a meeting with folks from a different federal agency, and very cautious, always very cautious. Oh, I don't know if we can do that because that might, trigger this thing and that thing, and maybe that's appropriate, but the supposedly all about trying to follow the rules and try to be responsible in this and that, but we keep running up against these things, these poor levee construction, these farces of certification of integrity and all this and that, I'm sort of at a loss as to how to go forward, because we've talked about it, right? We've tried to educate people. People are coming to this meeting here and they're learning about this. And I'm not, trying to say anarchy or something like that, but I it's a decade on of this massive, and there was other examples, but this was the most glaring, clear demonstration of absolute incompetence. And
so far.
Yeah.
Yeah, so far. They'll be worse.
Yeah, right.
I don't fancy myself a great imaginer of solutions. As a satirist and or documentarian, I just try to either make fun or point out what's wrong. But when I was touring with the film, people in the documentary business say you have to give the audience a call to action. At the end of The Cove, they said, call this 800 number and stop the slaughter of dolphins in Japan. Well, they had that 800 number at the end of the film. Last I heard, they're still slaughtering good dolphins in Japan. So I didn't put a call to action in my film. But when I was touring and an audience would ask that question, the Corps of Engineers, its immunity is not God-given and it's not constitutional. It was written into law by Congress after the 1927 Mississippi River flood. I guess the Congress gave the Corps immunity against legal action in flood control cases to try to foreclose the possibility of excessive bureaucratic timidity.
Freezing, yeah.
Yeah, freezing, paralyzing them. They built all this crap. They're not going to be building much more. They don't need it anymore. I would suggest a nice, appropriate first step would be to pester Congress people to say, get rid of this immunity, make them responsible for the work that they do, make them think twice about, my whistleblower friend said she's from Los Angeles. She talked to a couple of her friends who still work at the Corps District in New Orleans a couple of years ago. She's a little hard to startle at this point, but we were talking on the phone. She said, I just couldn't believe it. It's like it didn't bother them that they killed people.
Right.
It should bother them. And maybe they should have to spend a day in court. It's painful because if the Corps is found responsible for something like this, it's not their money, it's our money. It's like the Corps was just fined by EPA. Oh, I see. We'll take the money from the left pocket of the federal government and put it in the right pocket. But they should have the discomfort of being called into court and being held accountable in public for their misdeeds.
So I'll ask one more question, and then whoever else would like to come on up and start asking some questions, that would be great. So this next question is about something that sort of comes up now and again. We just had this settlement with BP that was supposed to yield all this money, which once you take the relief from taxes that they'll get and everything, it's not as big as everybody initially claimed. But there's this sort of sense in some circles that Louisiana is becoming something of a disaster economy, right? We have Katrina, and then we get some, wherever it comes from, federal government, whatever. We have BP, and then, hey, BP, you got to pay for this. And And so I'm just curious as to your take on that. Do you think that's a total ridiculous thing? Do you see that sort of in the public policy, or yeah, so that's my question. Is Louisiana becoming a disaster economy?
Well, the first half of that, the federal money that came in the wake of the flood is over, long over.
Sure. And it wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough. It was, we can say a few things about that money. A large proportion of it was to pick up the debris. The city was, imagine a city 80% flooded. Every house has to be cleaned out sometimes to the studs. There was a mountain of debris 3 stories high and 1.5 miles long down one street, one major boulevard in New Orleans. And it was like houses all over the city had just vomited their contents onto the sidewalks. That was a huge contract. It was given to the United States Army Corps of Engineers.
Tally-ho!
Yeah. Essayons. Let us try. That's their motto. And there was some investigative reporting, I believe, by the one-time newspaper down there, the Times-Picayune, that found that, and this is not unusual, again, for Defense Department work, but it was notable in this case, the price that the Corps was charging, or the Corps' prime contractor, because again, the Corps wasn't doing this work, they were contracting it out. Their prime contractor was charging them $72 a ton. There's a subcontractor, there's a sub-subcontractor, there's a sub-sub-subcontractor. 5 layers down, the guy with the truck who's actually picking it up is getting $5 a ton. This is the way that business works. So if that's a disaster economy,
right,
the economics of it are a disaster, because it's so much of it is caught in the interstices of the system.
Right.
As to the rest of it, who
oftentimes weren't local contractors, right? I mean, the $72 guys weren't Louisiana guys.
Some of them were Bow Brothers and people like that, but the guys with the trucks were like a lot of immigrants that came in to do that work.
Right.
Because there just weren't. Well, a lot of local people will say, we were here, we could have done that work. So I don't want to judge why those people ended up doing it. It has resulted in a much higher Latino proportion to the population than New Orleans had prior to that. So culturally, we've been enriched at least. As to the other part of it, we have been a disaster economy in the wrong sense of that word for 60 years. John Barry, who was on the levy authority until political interference forced him off, has pointed out in the pursuit of the lawsuit the levy authority filed, that for 60 years oil companies dug thousands of miles of canals and pipelines through the wetlands that used to protect New Orleans from the ferocity of storm surge and hurricane winds. They were legally bound by the permits that they had to build that stuff to put the wetlands back the way they found them when they were done. A requirement that was enforced.
They agreed to that. They signed the contract.
They signed those contracts. They have not lived up to them. One can argue that the economic cost of the destruction of the wetlands that they have abetted will never be equaled by any sort of input from them into the so-called disaster economy going forward. We didn't know at the time of the severity of sea level rise. We did know that the place was subsiding, partly because of the oil drilling, partly because of the draining of swamp. It's all man-made stuff, but the disaster economy to come is a pale shadow of the economic disaster we've undergone.
Okay, fair enough. So why don't we have 15 minutes or so if anybody wants to ask questions. You guys, why don't you come on up and just so Harry can see, come on up. If you guys want to come, just so
Yeah, because our oh so high tech thing to have a seat right there, and then he can see and go for it.
All right. Well, hello.
Hi.
I was just like, I'm not a engineer or anything like that, but it seems like the engineering is kind of basic that the levies would have failed. How are these people getting hired? Like how is there how are these? Like how are the? I don't know. Like I feel like if you have a basic degree in engineering, you would be able to tell all of these disasters. So like who's hiring these people? Why? Are they held accountable?
Yeah, they're not accountable. That's the first.
I realize they weren't accountable because of obviously, but are their names at least being put on something and then be like
A billboard somewhere?
yeah, like something.
There was a time when Corps of Engineers people signed their work, when it was a reputable agency, a world-class agency. I think I go to Ivor Van Heerden, who said that some of the mistakes at the London Avenue Canal were mistakes that wouldn't be made by a second-year engineering student. And I go to sort of common human nature. If you don't pay a price for screwing up, one is going to get more screwing up. If people don't even lose a parking place for killing 2,000 people, there's no reason for them to pay attention and do it right. Simple human laziness and stupidity take over. We are told in the private sector that the danger of not making a profit concentrates people's minds and disciplines them to work better. In the public sector, oversight should perform the same function, but the Corps of Engineers operates without oversight. There is an inspector general. You don't hear much from him. And when Maria Garzino, my whistleblower friend, went up through the ranks, the inspector general from the Corps of Engineers and the Department of Defense didn't take her findings seriously. It wasn't until she got to a much higher level that somebody actually hired an engineer to vet her stuff and said, oh my God, yeah, not only is she right, she's understating it. So any situation, any human situation where you don't get punished for screwing up, why go to the extra trouble of doing it right? That's who we are as a species,
Maybe it's a good idea if you do another documentary on how they hire them.
Don't wish that on me. Thanks.
No problem.
I just wanted to ask Harry, I think Katrina as a disaster was utilized by certain people. You probably agree with me. In the case of New Orleans, it cleared a lot of people out of the housing projects and gentrified a lot of New Orleans. I'm from Los Angeles as well, and I've seen the gentrification of Los Angeles, especially with the Great Recession of 2008. So maybe you could speak to that, how these disasters in which on one level, our leaders are saying we need to all come together and work together, yet right below the surface are real estate interests, our financial interests, and they're ruined our cities through this gentrification process, are dislocating. My son lived in San Francisco. There's no longer a working class in San Francisco. It's been completely gentrified. So we see again and again and again.
Yeah, I was just in San Francisco. I saw some of that. There are two or three things going on here at the same time, I think. One is there is international hot money that is looking for a place to park in a zero interest rate economy, which we've been having since the Great Recession started. International hot money, Russian oligarchs, Arabs, Greek money that is afraid of paying taxes. People from Asian countries, Malaysians, Chinese, there are oligarchs all over the place. They can't invest their money and make a profit. What they look for now is real estate. And so there are developers in London and New York and in Los Angeles who are building what they call ultra luxury projects. very tall buildings in New York and London, sprawling, assembling the sites of 9 what used to be called mansions in Bel Air into one super mansion in Los Angeles, where people don't even live. So you have the absolute destruction of neighborhoods because where those buildings are, and this is more apropos for New York and London than it is for LA, you have ghost buildings where 90% of the condos aren't even occupied. They are just parking places for money. And what happens to the businesses in those neighborhoods? They go down because there are no residents to patronize them. So that's one thing that's going. That's gentrification at the uppermost level. Then you have what happened in New Orleans, which was the federal government, which at the time was a Republican administration, was opposed ideologically to 2 things: public housing projects and public hospitals for the working poor and indigent. And they saw the destruction in New Orleans as an opportunity to, 1, get rid of Charity Hospital, which was a publicly owned, privately run, but well, privately run by LSU. I regard it as a private institution. Hospital for the working poor and the indigent. The number 2 trauma center in the United States at the time. To privatize the hospital system, they had a Republican governor come in to help them with that plan. There's a wonderful documentary about that called Big Charity that delineates exactly how that happened. And similarly, there was a Republican administration that was ideologically opposed to public housing projects. So the 4 big public housing projects in New Orleans, which were all habitable post-flood, were locked and closed, and the inhabitants could not even come back to retrieve their possessions. This stuff is hardcore.
I know I witnessed it at St. Bernard Housing Project. I saw that they didn't need to be torn down. The residents were prevented physically from going to their own home.
Yep, and even retrieving their goods.
Right.
That's how much we respect the sanctity of private property in this country. That being said, and those situations are, reprehensible in my opinion. There is something else going on in New Orleans as well, which is an influx of younger people who came in a lot of cases, came in to volunteer, fell in love with the city, went to Tulane, came back, saw that there were, it was a lovely city to live in, and started moving into neighborhoods like the Bywater, which had been the first guy I knew who lived in the Bywater was a professional mask maker, because it's New Orleans, and it was mid-90s, and I think he paid $10,000 for his house. But you couldn't walk the street after dark because it was a crack neighborhood. So it is now a lot more expensive than that. The other thing that happened in New Orleans to make it more difficult for working people to live there was not gentrification. It was the absence by the federal government of any program to assist people who owned rental housing to rebuild. The federal government had a program to assist homeowners to rebuild, and it was a lot of hoops they had to go through, and there were a lot of restrictions and a lot of ways that they were hampered. But they were still given some money to rebuild their own homes. Almost no money went to people who owned rental units. So most rental units in New Orleans are people who own 2 or 4 units. There's a neighborhood in New Orleans East where companies own 200 units. But in the main part of the city, it's mom and pop people who have a house of their own and then have a couple units. And if they're going to get paid a compensation to rebuild their house and no compensation to rebuild their rental units, which are they going to do? So there was a withdrawal of rental units from the market, and that immediately drove rental prices up. And there's been nothing to really solve that problem since. There is a shortage still of affordable rental housing in New Orleans. There's a shortage all over the country, as you've noted, but that's a particular cause in New Orleans, was that the federal government made a choice for some reason to help homeowners and not people who own rental housing.
Well, here's a fun fact. In Los Angeles County, there's 40,000 homeless, and there's 6 times that in empty units in the county of Los Angeles.
Yeah, yeah.
In a rational world, we would take the homeless and put them in the empty units, but that ain't gonna happen.
Will you take the homeless and put them in homes, you think?
That would redefine them.
Yeah. Yeah, then you'd have to redefine them.
You might have seen his book. It's called Driven from New Orleans, and he wrote a book on public housing and how they were able to shut these housing projects down. He has a question for you. His name's Shearer.
Hey, Harry.
Sit here, so
Okay. Yeah, I enjoyed your presentation. I just wanted to make one clarification on the important issue of the assault on public services and public housing and hospital in particular. Certainly the Republican administration that controlled the public housing authority, the Bush administration, the administrator, led the charge. But it also has to be underscored that the local Democratic Party apparatus, including the black mayor and black city council people, along with their white counterparts, were fully in support.
Absolutely right.
Of demolition. So this was thoroughly bipartisan. And on Charity Hospital, it wasn't the bad old Bush administration. In fact, they were offering money, despite all their problems, they were offering money to reopen Charity. They refused, and it was Kathleen Blanco, the Democratic governor, that shut down. And they were fighting to declare it 51% damage, so they could. We can talk about that. The other issue I just wanted to bring up on your.
Well, wait, let me just get to your point for a second. What is true? What I know is true is that FEMA, which was the feds, wanted to compensate for a non-total amount of damage at Charity. I forget what the percentage was, but it was, something way below 100%. LSU, which operated Charity, wanted to get 100% compensation because that was the money they were going to need to build a new hospital.
The point is, there's a narrative out there. You are correct that it was a Democratic mayor and a Democratic city council that voted unanimously to approve the tearing down of the things beforehand.
Yes.
There's a narrative out there that makes post-Katrina New Orleans the result and the disaster of the bad old Republicans, when it was in fact, a bipartisan initiative in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and in Washington, although they did have some differences on the margins. The question I had is around your argument that the left can't really use a critique of the Army Corps of Engineers. That's how I understood you. You couldn't really, the left or the right couldn't, because it was big government, and then there was this privatization. But in fact, it was a faux government operation, right? As you mentioned, everything had been contracted out. Similarly, like the Road Home program, it appeared as a big government failure, but in fact, it was all run by private operation. There's a very good book by McCann Adams, The Sorrows of the Market, that looks at that contradiction of these privatized public programs that are supposed to serve the needs of working class, middle class folks at the same time of making a profit. That contradiction is carried out by screwing over the supposed, the alleged recipients. And so I think there's a real strong left critique, and I'm going to be developing that in my follow-up presentation, which you can be here live. But what happened with Road Home, what happened with the Corps of Civil Engineers is an argument where we need direct government employment and overseeing of these public services. I think what happened with the Civil Corps of Engineers speaks to the failure of the market.
I think it speaks to the failure of public-private partnerships. I think public-private partnerships are a way to use public goods, public purposes to enrich private agents. And so, but because you don't get countervailing power, you don't get you get both sides in bed. You do get the worst of both worlds, I think. You don't get the point is, I
think there's an opening for the left if we're arguing for democratic massive infusion, democratically controlled public services. We can use that critique
I would love to hear it.
So we should about time to start migrating on, but we definitely have time if anybody else has another burning question they want to ask our man Harry.
Even a non-combustible question.
Would you read my movie script? No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding.
I have one last one that maybe we could end with on maybe something of a more positive note. So we talked about a lot of young folks coming to New Orleans in the wake, not just young people, but particularly young people, want to help and make a difference and whatever. I've also seen a huge flourishing and of the arts. A lot of new venues, a lot of new places, and so I was wondering if you could talk about how you think all this attention or infusion or crisis or whatever it is has produced some of the good things, and would you think the arts would be an example of that or no?
Yeah, I do. I think that New Orleans gets stereotyped in a million ways, and one of them is that the only art that's practiced there is musical. And I think that what's happened in the post-flood era is that it's always been a great writer's city. Ask Mr. Faulkner, but its community of visual artists, which has existed there for some time, has blossomed, has had a story to tell that they didn't have before, which is the story of coming through this horrific series of events. Art is supposed to be our way of responding to these things that happen to us. And I think the New Orleans artistic community, the art community, responded in a lot of ways. You had a curator who was in New Orleans at the time who started an art biennial, which now is a triennial, but who's counting? And especially the first iteration of it was there were pieces all over town, including in the lower ninth, in the midst of at that time fairly total devastation. So there was a citywide artistic response to this thing, and that has continued. There's been a large increase in galleries, a large presence of the visual arts around the town. And that's not because, as in New York and Los Angeles, there is a huge, well-heeled community of collectors. That's not collector-driven. That's artist-driven. It's a very different phenomenon. It's not because they can, churn out stuff and make big bucks at it. Music has responded to it as well, of course. But there's been a lot of writing. I was at a reading at Octavia Books the Thursday before the anniversary. A woman from the University of Mississippi had plowed through a bunch of blog posts from the first 2 years post-flood and made a book of that called Fast Forward. And it was interesting because a lot of people that I know really didn't want to re-experience any of that come the 10th anniversary. Really wanted to be as far away from that as possible. Right. But these were people who had written stuff who were willing to get up and re-experience it by reading their pieces. And Tom Piazza wrote a great book called Why New Orleans Matters. There's a big bookshelf now of stuff that's come out, and a lot. Dan Baum's book Nine Lives is a wonderful piece of work, one of the best books ever about New Orleans.
Which is part of an opera now, and right, right, yeah.
So, yeah, I think the city responded as a city of deep artistic temperament would to this event, with a million different kinds of artistic expression. Some of it, actually, some of the most memorable of it on the streets during the first Mardi Gras after the flood, be on the streets for that 2.5 weeks and see parade after parade that was making fun of Blanco and Bush and the Corps and Nagin and just this rolling festival of satire at the expense of those who had almost destroyed their city. I can't think of another city in the world that would have had that as a ritualized civic response to its near death. You know, I thought that was the moment. There were two moments when I thought New Orleans is going to make it as New Orleans. That Mardi Gras was one, and then I heard a story by John Besh, who's the great New Orleans chef, who was on a BBC show with me, and he, like Mr. Zaytoun, had a boat at the time of the flood and went out, and he said, well, what can I do? I can cook. So he made up a mess of red beans and rice, put it in a tureen on a can of Sterno, and went out in his boat and started, looking for, how you doing? And look for people who, and he said, he's a guy who's at chest high water, and he says, are you hungry? The guy says, am I? Come here, I got food. So the guy swims over to the boat, and John has like a styrofoam cup, and he ladles out some red beans, gives it to the guy, and the guy takes one taste, and he says, where's the onion? My mom had never made red beans. And the New Orleans is going to survive at that point. So that is a sense of a city with an indigenous culture, where culture is not an imported European thing that lives in concert halls and up on a hill. Culture is what's lived in the streets, whether it's the blowing of trombones, or whether it's the making of food, or whether it's the drawing of pictures. It is a deeply ingrained impulse in the life of the city, and it survives.
Awesome. So with that, we'll thank you again for being so gracious all these years helping us. And
My pleasure.
And,
always good to see you.
And we'll talk to you soon. And if people want to see Harry, you guys, they usually eat. The most next coming up thing would be their annual Christmas concert, where they have benefits not just in local cities, but also charities in New Orleans. So if you guys want to come support folks, you can check out Harry in November/December.
Thanks so much. Pleasure.
Thank you.
You know,